YouTube, or is it something else?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
Eventually, we're going to set up a sub account that is the Social Justice Speaker Series, but we're not there yet. So it'll eventually be moved to that. But for the time being, it is right off of the Niagara University site. In fact, I can even send you the link if you like.
Yeah, that might be useful. A couple friends are interested in this talk, and they're working. So thanks.
Okay, it's in the chat.
Great.
Great. Okay, I'm going to record, and now I'm going to run this. Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome Dr. Onaci, great to see you. Thanks very much for doing this, and welcome to all of the attendees. We have a fantastic program for today, and I'm really excited about the timeliness of this topic and the discussion as it relates to what we're doing within the course and more broadly for the Social Justice Speaker Series. Let me start with a quick introduction, and then we will jump right into the presentation. My name is Dave Riley. I am the chair of the Political Science Department and the Director of International Studies at Niagara University. I'm also a faculty advisor to the Justice House's Living and Learning Communities, along with my colleagues and professors, Kevin Hinckley and Leslie Pickering, who are with us today. So a little more than 4 years ago, Niagara University partnered with Burning Books of Buffalo to begin offering a social justice speaker series to our students, campus, and the broader community. The series has been a great success, with turnout and interest in the topics and speakers growing steadily, and awareness about social justice issues, broadly understood, has really grown. This has been a true collaboration with Burning Books, and we're very appreciative of this partnership. We really couldn't do it without them. It's their knowledge of the activist community and the availability to reach out and introduce us to people like Dr. Onaci that makes this all possible. So our series has been a compilation of activists, educators, and resistors across a spectrum of political and social issues. You saw many of them in the opening. Our new lead into our program, which is an exciting way to introduce you to everything we've been doing. We've met environmentalists, anti-war activists, investigative journalists, anti-racists, feminists, whistleblowers, legal and ethical advocates, animal rights defenders, political prisoners, and individuals who have fought for liberation across a spectrum of struggles. And the purpose of our series has been, and will continue to be, to engage the campus and the broader community in these struggles by introducing the ideas of individuals who have been active participants and who have led those struggles. We believe we have been able to contribute to important dialogue, both on and off campus, and to motivate our students and our community to work for social justice. So today's talk with Dr. Edward Onaci is titled Exploitation, Not Reparation: What 21st Century Activists Can Learn from the Endurance of Racial Capitalism and the Valiant Struggles Against It. Dr. Onaci teaches courses on African American history, modern US history, women's global political struggles, social movements, and music in Africa and its diaspora, and more at Ursinus College. He's the author of Free the Land, The Republic of New Africa and the Pursuit of a Black Nation State, a fantastic book. And I want to read one passage that actually is the end to his epilogue that I think hopefully captures the idea of what we're going to be doing today. So in reference to the New African Independence Movement, he says, knowing the actors and organizations behind various ideas and actions, grasping their motives and goals, and struggling with the strengths and weaknesses of the movement will be vital to the development of new ideas and strategies to undermine oppression. Exposing and measuring the silences that still remain will require all of the intellectual tools at our disposal, not just the methods of history and sociology, but geography, performance and film theory, communication studies and rhetoric, economic theory, and more. To fully understand the complexity of liberation struggle in America, the story of the New African Independence Movement must not be silenced. And so with that, I'm very pleased to introduce you all to Dr. Onaci.
All right, thanks so much. I'm going to share my screen here. All right. I really appreciate the opportunity to present. This is some early stage research, and I'm grateful that I get to share it with you. So my thanks to Niagara University and to Burning Books for this opportunity. What I'm going to talk about today concerns some ways that Black revolutionary nationalism intersected with US politics, particularly through participation of both the Democrat and Republican parties, but more importantly for this presentation, how they thought about Black autonomous economic activity, which was conditioned upon reparative justice. Okay, so I'm gonna be talking about reparations and the ways that people have thought about it over time and how it continues to be with us. And so what I'm presenting, as I said, is a reflection of how I'm thinking about a new project, how I'm bridging from my old work on the New African Independence Movement and my thoughts on an array of ideas regarding reparations for African descended people who live at ground zero of the US empire. All right, I'm trying some old technology that has been phased out. So I always have to look twice to make sure that everything's working, but it shouldn't be, I shouldn't have to do that too much. And just before I really get in where my cursor is right now, I'm gonna reference these two paragraphs a couple of times without saying when I'm quoting. So I just wanted to make everyone aware of that. So standing in front of the Lincoln Memorial on August 28th, 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. reminded an audience that 1 century earlier, the overwhelming majority of African people in America were enslaved. 100 years later, he explained, Black people were languished in the corners of American society, exiled in the land that was supposed to be home. He continued by likening the nation's founding documents to a promissory note that guaranteed the unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today, he said, that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. The point here is that the United States owes Black people for centuries of oppression. In the section that we just read, King demands the riches of freedom and the security of justice as compensation for debt. He elaborates on these ideas in his book, Why We Can't Wait, which was published the following year. Again, citing the nation's history of racial slavery, he explains that enslaved Africans did not own their own bodies in labor. Instead, they were property stolen by others. King quickly reminds his readers that although the slavery of pre-1865 America was gone, the racist institutions and logics that devalued African and African descended people persisted. The rationale that previously justified American slavery caused the most upstanding white citizens to ask, what is the Negro willing to pay if we give him his freedom? What is the Negro willing to pay if we give him his freedom? Antebellum American citizens and their elected officials were in the habit of refusing to compensate African peoples for their stolen bodies and stolen labor. Prior to the Civil War, the enslaved, along with their short supply of allies, purchased emancipation for themselves and their loved ones whenever they could. In bondage, their bodies and labors benefited somebody else. And according to the logic of racial capitalism, ending that arrangement placed an enslaved Black person in debt to a white citizen because freeing an enslaved African constituted the loss of a white man's property. After 1865, the destruction of the pre-war version of enslavement continued to be seen by American citizens, North and South, and portions of the federal government as a loss of property. It's worth mentioning that Pennsylvania and other northern states had already found ways to compensate northern slave owners for their lost property during the very slow, and I would say white supremacist process of quote unquote gradual emancipation. Northern states had initiated gradual emancipation in the aftermath of the US War for Independence. On the eve of the Civil War, some states were still gradually freeing people. The idea was that because African and African descended people were incapable of being autonomous and sovereign individuals who could govern themselves, right? And because the white population that was helping lift them from African savagery, their words, not mine, was now being deprived of labor compensation in exchange for their dedication to civilizing these Black folks. And so it was now Black people's responsibility to pay those supposedly well-meaning white Americans. Abraham Lincoln, who subscribed to such notions about African inferiority, similarly wanted to attend to lost property. Therefore, he fully supported and attempted to institute a plan to compensate white people for the loss of their human chattel throughout the Civil War. The ideas and actions of Lincoln and others make clear that attempts for and by Black people to achieve freedom, self-determination, independence, and the protection of their most basic civil and human rights have been treated from the time of America's independence to that March on Washington that King spoke at as transactions in which Black people were debtors. By 1963 and 1964, Dr. King was trying to combat that idea that Black people must compensate the United States of America whenever they take a step toward freedom. His opening words to his most famous 1963 speech attempt to invert the logic of Black indebtedness. King argued that instead of locking little girls in Lee County stockade when they challenged segregation, honor the promissory note. Instead of telling Black people that their demand for freedom now, jobs and justice was too radical and asking for too much too soon, honor the promissory note. The logical conclusion of King's attempts to invert the dehumanizing rationale of anti-Blackness was to call for financial reparations. To my knowledge, though, I don't think he did. And I've seen no evidence of that. However, in 1963, Queen Mother Ali Moore, the elder woman on the left, along with economist and university professor Robert S. Brown, and the people to the right who formed the provisional government of the Republic of New Africa, they used logic similar to King's to make a case for compensating the descendants of the enslaved for human trafficking, forced labor, sexual, physical, and psychological abuse, discrimination, segregation, and racist riots throughout the North up to 1865, and for expanded racist terrorism, more forced and coerced labor, more discrimination, more segregation, and the added refusal to protect Black people's civil and human rights now under, in the time since the adoption of the 13th, 14th, and 15th, and later even the 19th Amendments. So my research has allowed me to study the New African independence movement. It was a revolutionary Black nationalist movement for self-determination that Moore helped co-found in 1968, just 5 days before the assassination of Dr. King. The movement built on King's legacies, or through his ideas, built on his ideas through two interrelated arguments. First, New Africans argued that the 14th Amendment should have been extended as an offer to a freed people who had not, prior to that moment, been given a chance to decide whether they wanted to be in the United States of America. To dig a little bit deeper into that point, it's important to understand that they argued that Black people in the United States were what they called paper citizens. The term helps capture Black people's political relationship to the state, claiming that they were citizens on paper, but without any of the rights and protections that being a part of the citizenry is supposed to guarantee. So the term paper citizen indicates that once freed, the formerly enslaved people, or I should say the logic of paper citizen helps us understand that once freed, the formerly enslaved were an independent nation, okay? The passage of the 13th Amendment, according to this argument, should have come with some time for this independent nation and opportunity to educate themselves about the various options regarding where to place their consent of citizenship. However, because the US government assumed, and reluctantly at that all Black people were to be folded into the body politic, New Africans argued that the advent of the 14th Amendment actually forced United States citizenship onto them, even though it should have been offered as one of the many choices that they could have decided on. So further, the citizenship was incomplete, right? This is what King's talking about. It was an incomplete citizenship, offering little protection of the basic civil and human rights under the law. So instead of becoming fully functioning and self-determined members of the United States, they remained exploited, terrorized, criminalized, and carefully placed in economic indebtedness with no recourse through the established legal and socio-political channels of the body politic. So as paper citizens, then African and African descended people continued to have no rights that white citizens and their government were bound to respect. For these and other reasons, Moore and her comrades in the New African Independence Movement believed that once given the opportunity to make an educated choice, most Black people would opt to create their own independent nation state. New African's second argument is actually related to the first. It's rests actually on this pursuit of Black self-determination, the creation of an independent nation state. New Africans claim that as descendants of stolen peoples who were never compensated for America's crimes against them, and typically, as I think we could all agree, criminals are supposed to owe a debt to the injured, not vice versa. But as survivors of ongoing racist oppression that manifests in all areas of Black life, they were due 5 states and a financial settlement as part of a reparations package. And you can see this image has the 5 states on it. They are Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina. These states, as part of this broader reparations package, would be transferred to the provisional government of the Republic of New Africa, and that land would become known as the land, the Republic of New Africa. Okay, so we have a provisional government. That's the PGRNA, just so you can keep up with some of the names and acronyms I'm starting to throw out. We have the RNA, which is the Republic of New Africa. That is both the land that's in this image, but also the people who make up the nation that wants that land. So the land would become a part of the Republic of New Africa. The money would be paid by the United States government to Black people, including those who want to remain within the US, because it is one of the choices that should be rightfully theirs, right? To stay United States citizens. But also to those who want to build their own independent nation state in that 5-state territory. In 1972, the Republic of New Africa released what they called their anti-depression program. And that was a plan that was designed to end poverty, dependence, cultural malnutrition, and crime while promoting interracial peace. Filed with the US Congress the year it was published, the program posited 3 legislative requests that delineated how their fulfillment would help solve some of US society's problems. And I'll just talk about the first 2. The first act, through the first act, New Africans suggested that they should be allowed to authorize with the United States government a peaceful release of land and sovereignty to the PGRNA wherever Black people vote for independence. Second, they pursued an act that would authorize a reparations payment to the PGRNA as compensation for slavery and warfare against African and African descended peoples in the US. This is 1972. And so their suggestion of 300 billion as fair compensation might sound a little low to some people, but at the time they thought that was the right number. And I said I wouldn't mention the third act, but I might as well since I mentioned it. And it basically would authorize the 2 governments, the provisional government of the RNA and the US government, to negotiate all the fine details of a reparations agreement between the 2 nations. Since writing the anti-depression program, New African ideas about nationhood, paper citizenship, and financial payment have been adopted elsewhere. And the most recognizable group to adopt these ideas is actually a coalition called the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, which was founded in 1989. It's important to say they were adopted by N'COBRA because N'COBRA was, the creation of N'COBRA was spearheaded by this guy right here, Imari Obadeli, who was one of the founders of the New African Independence Movement and one of the people who came together in 1968 to create the provisional government of the Republic of New Africa. Not only him, there were also people like Chokwe Lumumba, who some people may be familiar with because he was, for a very short time, mayor of Jackson, Mississippi, and now his son is the mayor, and his daughter works with the son to help do a lot of things in and around Jackson. There was also Nkechi Taifa, who this poster right here says "Free the RNA 11." There's a whole story behind that, which I would love to talk about if someone wants to know. But she helped create the committee to free the RNA 11. So these are people who held rank within the provisional government in various ways, and they were the ones who brought all these different people together to create NCOBRA. And so to this day, people continue to call Imari Obadeli the father of the modern reparations movement because of his central role. Okay, and so I want to let's move on. Before getting into a couple of other points, I just think it's important for those for whom this idea of reparations may be new. It's important for us to just have a little bit of a timeline, and it's a very incomplete timeline. But I'm gonna begin. I could begin really with the U.S. War for Independence, but for the sake of time, we'll just start in the 1960s with Queen Mother Audley Moore's very short pamphlet called Why Reparations, which she wrote in 1962 and published, probably published it in 1962, but it says 1963. I mentioned her because in the early 1960s, she was working with organizations that were promoting these ideas, the ones that made it into that anti-depression program that I just very quickly went through. One of the organizations she worked with was the Reparations Committee for the United States Slaves Descendants Incorporated, and they're actually the ones who put their name on that pamphlet, Why Reparations. She also helped create the African Descendants National Independence Partition Party, which basically was all the same people, but also included folks like Robert F. Williams from Monroe, North Carolina. And again, they pushed the same ideas. And these ideas eventually made their way into the provisional government. In 1969, for those of you who have read up about the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, in 1969, former SNCC activist James Forman put together the National Black Economic Development Conference. And it was a pretty interesting program. Among other things, he wanted to get money specifically from religious institutions to fund the creation of basic infrastructures that would allow Black people to be self-reliant and would eventually lead towards some self-determination. He based what we called, he based the National Black Economic Development Conference in Detroit, and all around Detroit, there were people who were working on economic development projects. Some of them framed their ideas as this is how we're going to eventually work toward actual reparations. First, we just need to get some government money to do X, Y, and Z for our people, and that will give us that'll help us bring enough people in to make a formal demand. And there's a lot of cross-pollination between what Foreman was doing and what the folks in the New African Independence movement were doing. Of course, in 1972, we have the anti-depression program. Around that same time, there's the beginning of a flurry and then a flood of scholarship. And I named some of the key texts here, not all of them, but you'll see that I have Boris Bittker there. I have Lumumba, Obadeli, and Taifa, who I mentioned before. They published a book called Reparations, Yes. And most recently, a book that's gotten a lot of attention is William A. Darity Jr. and Kristen Mullen's book, From Here to Equality, which I highly recommend that folks check out if you're interested in what reparations, how people have theorized reparations and what they're saying it could be. And there are a number of organizations all over the country that are working on these issues. Going back to NCOBRA, even though the folks who created it had been working on reparations initiatives for decades, right, as this very brief short timeline shows, what really spurred the creation of that umbrella organization, that coalition, was the Civil Liberties Act for Japanese American survivors of U.S. internment in 1988. Again, African Americans were working on creating some sort of body to really take control of this and push the demand for reparations forward. But with the passage of that act, it was what they needed to really just put everything together. And then, as I already mentioned, there's also a number of organizations that have formed, including in Cobra. So these ideas about repair create a challenge for those of us who I'm saying inherit the work of reformers like King and revolutionaries such as the New Africans, who I mentioned. Currently, the most popular phrase in the most popular phrase in Black political life and activism is Black Lives Matter. I mean, defund the police is starting to get up there, I would argue, but I think Black Lives Matter is still the most popular phrase. It's everywhere. The phrase critiques this long history of valuing African peoples only in as much as they can bring wealth and power to white society. Like King and the others who I just mentioned, people who say Black Lives Matter are expressing a basic human desire to be valued on their own terms and for their own self-defined goals. No matter, while no amount of compensation, financial or otherwise, will ever make up for the multitude of crimes committed against them, at its best, Black Lives Matter acknowledges that it is in line with the ethos of this country for wrongdoers to pay for the harm they caused, and is just one aspect of a comprehensive project for justice. So what I'm saying here is, even something like Black Lives Matter that might not appear to be talking about reparations on the surface, it potentially has the power to reverse what the title of this talk is, right? Whereas it was exploitation, not reparation. It potentially has the power to move us toward reparation and ultimately to defeat the conditions that make exploitation possible, okay? And I wanna just kind of end by explaining what I mean here. If you look at the Movement for Black Lives website, right? This is the M4BL that folks probably see on memes all over the place. If you look at their website, you'll see that among the various items on their platform is a demand for reparations. And I highly recommend that you review it. You can reflect on how the reparations demand builds on King and on the New Africans who I mentioned. It builds on both of their legacies. Think about what it means to be valued, fully valued, in a society that prioritizes financial gain and security in its domestic and global agenda. And by security, I mean militarism, really, right? Military stuff for the protection of capital. If Black people's lives are to be valued independently, in other words, not in connection with profits or power that others can potentially derive from them, then America must honor its promissory note to the fullest extent. Okay, and so it's important to mention that in that platform for reparations, you'll see some of the ideas that I mentioned. They're not probably not fully reflected because M4BL, like in Cobra, is a coalition, but there are people from some of the organizations that are a part of the New African Independence Movement legacy who are sitting at those tables and helping put together these demands for reparations, right? And most specifically, if you've ever heard of the Malcolm X grassroots movement, that's one of the organizations that's a part of M4BL. Malcolm X grassroots movement was created by the New African People's Organization, and New African People's Organization was created by none other than Chokwe Lumumba in 1984, Malcolm X's birthday in 1984. And so the connections to this legacy, to both King, right? This, somewhat reformist legacy of King, but also this revolutionary legacy of the New African Independence Movement, which is still ongoing and making a lot of the demands about land and reparations. We can see it reflected even in the broader array of groups that claim that Black Lives Matter. Okay, and it's something, again, that I highly recommend you look into by visiting their website. And so ultimately, as the subtitle here says, we really need to think about how reparations can help us move um, toward justice and away from exploitation of all oppressed peoples nationally and internationally. And I will stop there. Thank you. I would love to have some conversation. If you all have questions or comments that you would like to make, I welcome it.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Onaci. Really interesting and really connects to a lot of the things that we've spoken about in the class. I just elevated Professor Pickering to the panelist role in particular so that you can talk a little bit, Professor Pickering, about the connections that we were discussing earlier today in some of the incarceration of Black Panthers and how the evolution of that has changed and maybe how that connects to some of this discussion.
Yeah, sure. I'll talk about one case in particular, that of Jalil Muntakim, who was a member of the Black Panther Party in the Bay Area mostly, and connected with people who were involved in a clandestine underground element of the Black liberation struggle known as the Black Liberation Army, and then was incarcerated for 49 years because of that. And I think that the part that is most relevant here is that it's important to understand that these different efforts weren't isolated. Something else that I was looking at for a different class this morning really has me thinking about this. The situation with the growth of the nonprofit model as the one and only legitimate way to organize for social change has this side effect, or perhaps an intentional effect, of isolating all, not just our different struggles, but our different organizations within the same struggle. They become competitors for the same resources and the same handouts. And if you look at these movements that are more asking for more fundamental and radical change, you see that they can't afford to be competing with each other. They have a big enough enemy already, and they are building alliances between each other. And you'll notice that people involved in the Black liberation struggle during this period are oftentimes overlapping with several movements. And so I had the fortunate opportunity of being at Jalil Muntakim's birthday party the other day, shortly after he was released from prison. And one of the things that he did speak about was about the Republic of New Africa, right? And about how that struggle was so integral to things that were going on nowhere near those 5 states, all across the country. And he worked with Herman Aliyah and others who were really close, Herman Ferguson and Aliyah Ferguson, and really close to that movement, and incorporating a lot of the ideas of that movement, which they saw as all part of one large movement. And so Jalil talked a lot about, this is just about 1 week after he was let out of prison, a group of people who were largely his family and his new local community in Rochester, New York, just about an hour from here in Buffalo. Talked a lot about this very topic, right? That reparations haven't been really offered, haven't been really created or paid, and that people were never given the opportunity to choose between different possibilities, even bringing up the idea of something closer to what indigenous people of this country have in terms of a relationship with, I call them reservations, but the sovereign states, and so there's a whole range of different things that could be possible in this scenario. And I think that as white American people, we see those 5 states and we hear about this years later and we think, what? What about Florida? and stuff like that. It just seems really hard. Like, our imagination is very small. We're clearly not grasping the depth of the situation. So I guess I would like to pose that question, because I know this is a new idea to a lot of the students and other people who are watching this right now. Why those 5 states, and what about Florida?
What about Florida? Exactly. People have been asking that question since. So the provisional government of the Republic of New Africa was founded on March 30th, 1968. By March 31st, people were asking why not Florida? Okay, or I guess April. Wait, how many months and days in that month? April 1st, maybe. And so the short version is that according to their reading of history, and I want to be clear about that because I prefer a little bit more nuance than what I'm about to provide here. Okay, according to their reading of history, first and foremost, those are the 5 states, even in 1968, where the majority of the Black population was living. Okay, and it was a little bit more than half. And by that time, people who had moved north as part of the Great Migration, they were actually already beginning to return south. Okay, and it's only picked up speed since then. So their argument was, well, that's where that's our ancestral homeland, basically. It's where the majority of Black people have lived since being brought as captives to this country. Another part of it is just right in line with that, because that's where the majority of the people lived, majority of the land where the majority of Black people were enslaved, that's where they did the most work to create the wealth of the United States of America. And so as just compensation, just give them those states. That was a part of the argument. There were some strategic arguments. They said, hey, it's along the Gulf Coast, access to Cuba, and those types of things. But they argued that Florida did not have that same history, that Florida was actually should be reserved for indigenous peoples, which, of course, that just 15 people just asked the question, wait a minute, I'll get to that as well. What about indigenous peoples? They said it wasn't, they didn't have the same claim ultimately, historically or contemporaneously. And then I remember reading in an interview that Gaidi Obadeli did, that's the brother of Imari Obadeli, who I showed you the picture of. He also said that besides, it's not militarily defensible. And what that means, he never elaborated on. He just didn't think it was the best place. I would think if part of the goal was to get closer to Cuba, then Florida would be ideal. But again, their reading of history and geography and all that stuff, not mine. I mentioned in passing indigenous nations. So it was from the beginning and of the creation of this new African independence movement. And by time the provisional government created their constitution, which they call the Code of Umoja, they always said that we recognize that first and foremost, indigenous people have just claims to this land that precede ours and supersede ours. Okay. And what they did, but at the same time, they argued that as people who were not settlers, but who were brought as captives by settlers who were the ones who were in the wrong, they still needed to have some sort of compensation to help rectify the situation that they were placed in. And so they, from the beginning, established relationships with key members of the American Indian movement. They reached out to various indigenous nation leaders, everyone from the Navajo to the Cherokee, whoever they could have some sort of audience with. And they said exactly what I just said. Look, your claims to the land precede ours. No matter where in the country you are, your claims to the land precede ours. And we want to work with you to create something where we can both get what we deserve based on the crimes of the US government. And so I'll stop right there for now. I would love, what other questions do you have?
We've got a question from Matt McKenzie, so I will promote him and give him an opportunity to ask.
Hello. My question kind of goes, I guess, to the kind of more international lens, so with like what was mentioned in your presentation, how would you think that fits in, like that perception with like the way like reparations and then like physical land not being granted to what would be freed people? How does that like factor into definitely like colonial people internationally, and essentially like when they fight for liberation? So like with the Haitian Revolution, them being forced to pay their former colonial oppressor, like essentially like reparations for their freedom.
Well, in some ways, that makes up the foundation of logic that the New African Independence Movement, that King, and that a whole host of activists have been trying to invert. Because yeah, people saw that. They saw what happened to Haiti, and as revered as Haiti has been for people struggling for Black liberation, that is a conspiracy by a couple of Western nations to undermine an actual revolution, which they say never happened in the United States of America. And in fact, Gerald Horne wrote a book called The Counter Revolution of 1776 to really just hammer home that point. And so, yeah, that's how it factors in. Um, just to work with this a little bit more, because you also talked about just colonized peoples writ large, if I heard you correctly. And part of one of the other foundational arguments was that as New Africans struggle for their liberation, their self-determination, they need to be in close communication and solidarity with other African peoples who are similarly struggling, and with people in Latin America who left and right are having, well, let me not over exaggerate, but several who were the United States was installing dictators to rule over. And I mentioned Cuba, but they were also thinking about uh, other Caribbean colonies and states at the same time. And just one of the inspirations for the New African Independence Movement was actually Ghana. Gaidi Obadeli, who made the comments about Florida being militarily indefensible, he went to Lincoln University with Kwame Nkrumah when Nkrumah was in the United States. And he met a lot of people at Lincoln who became who held positions within Nkrumah's government. And so in 1963, 64, it had to have been 64, he actually traveled to Ghana with Malcolm X. And he saw people who he went to college with making decisions that had a direct impact on their people immediately. Whereas he, as a city commissioner for Pontiac, Michigan, as the only African American out of I think 5, he said that anytime he tried to make decisions that would help Black people, he got shot down. So here he is, a Black elected official, right? Because that's how people have framed Black power for good reasons, right? Let's get some political power, then we can make some changes. And he came to understand, based on those experiences, that political power when you're on the shores of the US empire doesn't matter. You have to get rid of the basis of the US empire, or else you're going to continue to experience what nations like Haiti experienced, what Cuba experienced, more recently what Venezuela, Bolivia, and others experienced. So does that help you? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, definitely.
Appreciate
mean,
it.
that's ideas that I've been thinking about, especially for getting out under the US's thumb. You can never really break it unless you like actually like sever it, and then how do you get away from their influence? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question.
Our next question is from Abdias Kwamati.
Can you like talk a little bit more about like the RNA 11, since like you mentioned it during your the presentation?
And I'm sorry, just make sure I heard you correctly. You would like to hear what part? You just want more information, or is there something in particular?
More information about the RNA 11.
Oh, the RNA 11. Okay. Yeah. So Good question. Where to begin? All right, the short version is that the provisional government was created in Detroit, Michigan. Okay. But they claimed from that time those 5 states. And eventually, some of the leadership from the provisional government decided to move to the South and begin to really work in the communities that they're trying to liberate for the new African independence movement. Not Gaidi Obadeli, this would be Imari Obadeli. He actually at this point was the president, and he was bringing people down south. They moved into a house in Jackson, Mississippi that's actually right across the street from Jackson University. But they also had access, I don't know if they owned it or if they rented it, but they had access to another property about a mile away. And they had people basically living in both properties. While they're there trying to do the work of creating this independence movement, somebody visited them who they didn't know and who they identified as someone who would bring them trouble. This young man traveled from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where he was accused of committing a murder, drove through Memphis, Tennessee, all that stuff, had the FBI follow him the whole way, by the way. So they knew where he was. Okay, I want to make that clear. They knew where he was and how to find him. Drove through, these various states, made his way to Jackson, Mississippi, stayed there for a few days. And while staying there for a few days, the Jackson State, the Mississippi State Police, the Jackson Police, and the FBI said, let's raid that house that's across the street from Jackson University. And under the pretense that we're serving an arrest warrant for this guy who is alleged to have committed a murder in Milwaukee. Okay, so he's there for about 4 days. He leaves, and 2 days later, that's when they have the raid. And according to the FBI records, they knew that he was already in New Orleans, but they had the raid anyway. Hopefully that's sounding very familiar, because we might have had something like that happen recently, maybe in Louisville, Kentucky, right? Where they knew the guy wasn't there, but they went through with the raid anyway. During that raid, so a lot of New Africans came from the Black Panther Party. Some of them were part of the Black Liberation Army. Others were part of the Panther Underground, which my understanding is distinct. And some had military training. They knew how to fortify this residence where they were living, and they knew how to defend themselves. So when these forces come through, the Jackson Police, the Mississippi State Police, the FBI, with a tank, with whatever other arms they have, the residents of that house, or the occupants of that house, because they actually didn't live there, they shot back, to I guess borrow from Akinyele Umoja's title, right? They shot back, and they didn't have any casualties, but they did injure a couple of officers, and they killed one police officer before they finally actually had to surrender, because the whole time they're trying to find out how to get out, because they had some escape hatches and things like that. So there were 7 people on that property. There were 4 people on that other property who I mentioned, including Imario Badeli. He was staying at that other property and was not involved with this shootout at all. When the police came knocking on that door, he put his hands out the door first, then the rest of his body, stripped naked, surrendered. So did everybody else in that house. But these 11 people were charged with conspiracy to kill officers, okay? Among other things. They were also initially charged with trying to levy war against the state of Mississippi and all these other things. They were attacked, but they were charged with trying to levy war, right? Interesting. And so they became known as the RNA 11. 4 of them were convicted of various crimes, 3 of murder, first degree, because apparently it was premeditated, even though they were attacked at 6 in the morning when they were asleep. Imario Badeli was convicted of having illegal weapons, as were a couple of other people. He also was convicted of felony murder because the argument was that he told them to kill police officers. The other folks, they actually didn't serve much time, but they remained a part of the RNA 11. And so this committee to free the RNA 11 was an attempt to gain, to raise awareness around the world about these people who were now prisoners of war, and to raise money for legal fees, and to eventually get them out of prison. And just to, I guess there's a happy ending, a happy in quotes ending to this story. All of them actually did get out by the early 1980s because of a technical mistake that someone in the prison system got fired for. And basically they were they had too many people in the prison where these folks were, and they had to let some people out. And so the plan was for people who were serving both state and federal time to, and I probably am messing up some of the details, but the plan was to let them out to do their federal time. But what happened is when you let people out to do federal time, it's almost as if you're saying, well, you've served your state time, so you can't go back to prison for that. And the federal charges were much less than the state charges. And so that was in the like 1976, 1977. And so many of them were out by 1980 and 1981. And I actually think all of them got out by 81. So yeah, that's the RNA 11. And Nkechi Taifa was she was given the responsibility of creating that committee.
Can I ask a follow-up question about COINTELPRO and the RNA? It goes to what Professor Pickering was saying about we can't afford to be competing with each other.
Yeah.
There are really two strategies that I want to ask you about as they relate to today in the Black Lives Matter movement. So two things that we saw really clearly with the RNA was, number one, the disruption strategies and the willingness to arrest even without sound charges just to be able to disrupt, right? That was one thing. And there was a lot of harassment on the part of the FBI toward the RNA. The second was to try and create a divide between the RNA and the Black Panther Party and any other groups. And in particular, in some of my research as a grad student, I remember finding a letter that supposedly had been written by Amari Obedelli to the Black Panthers claiming fealty and that he was willing to turn his back on the Republic of New Africa if they paid him enough, that sort of a thing. You see those kinds of strategies today in the Black Lives Matter movement as well. I know COINTELPRO officially no longer exists, but it seems like the same strategies are operating. And what kind of lessons might we draw from that based on looking at history?
Yeah, I love that question. The main lesson that I have taken away from it, and that other folks who I've spoken with have also taken away, is security, security, security. And security means it's made up of a number of different things. First and foremost, it's intelligence, right? So you have to know who you're around to the best of your ability, and you have to know what their histories are, who's around them, et cetera, et cetera. And you have to know who doesn't like you, right? So if the police are knocking at your door every day asking questions, then they probably don't like you, and you have to know who they are. And what ends up happening is people are able to develop very simple ways of eventually weeding people out, right? Based on whether or not they're agents or informants and things like that. Some of it has gone wrong in the past, right? So a lot of folks would say intelligence is important, but you also have to be very careful with how you use it, because people actually have gotten killed. They've killed each other because they had bad information. But intelligence would be one. Self-defense is another. Knowing, and self-defense is at the foundation of self-defense is discipline. And so if you study what the police have been doing all across the country, they really only have three moves. They shoot tear gas and rubber bullets, and they shoot them in ways that are supposed to permanently maim people, by the way. So they aim for eyes and things like that. So folks need to know that they can start to protect themselves. They also, with the tear gas, they use it to try to kettle people in particular ways away from the press, who they also harass, so that they can do whatever they need to do, right? So just studying how these forces of the state operate, and having the discipline to, first of all, continue to do the study, but also to have your people aware so that they can make the proper moves at the proper time. That's a part of it. And then another part of it is communication. You know, how do you communicate your messaging in the age of quote unquote fake news, when even though the mainstream press, the mainstream, I'll say moderate and liberal press, is generally says that they're in favor of the protests, at the same time they demonize them in really blatant ways by talking about the rioters and the broken windows and the burned police cars. But we're not talking about the peaceful protests, but you just kind of painted them all as non-peaceful protests. And even if they're turning over a police car, is that equivalent to killing somebody? Under the capitalist system, is worse than killing somebody, by the way. But so those are some of the lessons that I've taken away, and other people who I was actually fortunate to interview, they also talk quite a bit about security. It's just, that's got to be whatever people ultimately come up with. Security has to be at the foundation.
Great, thank you. And I would agree in a lot of what I saw as well. I can remember looking at some of the meeting notes, and there were 3 or 4 informants at every meeting of the RNA as they were forming in Detroit. It was incredible.
Yeah.
Okay, we have a question from Violet. Violet, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Sorry, I had to, it made me rejoin the webinar for a second. My question was, what is the appeal of Black independence or sovereignty over justice and equality within the US state? I don't want to draw any sort of comparison between Black nationalism and white nationalism, but that idea has always struck me as weirdly similar to the creation of an ethno-state. So I was just wondering if I could get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that is a really important question. And I would say first and foremost, they're not talking about an ethno-state. They're talking about a Black government-run independent nation that would do a better job, they say, of looking out for the interests of all people who live there than the United States does, because they're not going to base their governing on these economic logics of racial capitalism. Okay. And so the appeal is just that. We can do a better job governing ourselves than you have done for the past 500 and something years. Another part of it is they wanted to destroy worldwide white supremacy and capitalist imperialism. And they argued that if you create an independent Black nation state, you're taking this super exploited group of people who are in solidarity with indigenous people, with Puerto Ricans, with Chicanos, with folks who call themselves North American anti-imperialists. These are white folks, white revolutionaries, right? And so it's going to destroy the very foundation of the United States' ability to generate capital and exploit people, right? And it's also going to be in solidarity with these other nations that are similarly trying to rise up and overthrow Western imperialism and create something better for the whole world. And so that's really the appeal, how they said it. Now, also to still address your question about what I'll say is just bigotry, there are always those people. Always. There are some people who have told me when they learn what I research, oh yeah, I would love to just be able to live without white people. Well, that's not exactly what they were trying to do. They in fact said any white person who wants to live under the Black government is welcome to stay here.
Okay, that clears a lot of things up. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for the question.
So I wanted to jump in with a question. First, thank you so much. This is fascinating and so critically important. But I'm struck that the ideas that you're presenting really didn't come up at the first presidential debate.
Yeah.
Maybe I
Well,
missed it, right? Maybe I missed it
I think we all
in the
did.
maelstrom. But who knows? There's one more debate allegedly going to happen on Thursday. So maybe that debate will focus on reparations and the legacy of enslavement, lynching, racial terror in the United States. But what are we to do then? For students who are interested in organizing and advocating for change, what to make of the calls to get out and vote, right? That will solve all of the problems.
Oh, what a great way to end your question. Get out and vote, that will solve all the problems. Well, the first thing to do is to reject that argument. Voting is important. It's a tool, right? I have keys. I have all these different tools that I use on a daily basis. And when it comes to politics, we should think of it as the same way. It is one of many tools. At the same time, knowing that it is a limited tool with a limited function means we also have to organize for other possibilities. And I'm not saying what you might hear on, I don't know, fill in the blank, liberal left media outlet where, oh, we're going to push Biden to the left. No, you're not. No, you're not. He's creating the Republican Party right now to push the Democrats back to the right. And so you're not going to push him to the left. What can happen is that there are some people within the Democrat Party who are more progressive and lean pretty heavily to the left. And there are people at the local level who can run for or already occupy different offices that you can start to organize. Once you organize, you start to get their ear and you start to try to influence the policy decisions that they make at the local level and that they try to push at the federal level. I'm gonna get, the whole chat thing's gonna blow up and people are gonna have a lot of hateful questions when I say this, but I would argue that it's also important to think about how independent parties could function within this broader strategy. Again, it's a tool. It's a tool. Can you create a party that explicitly wants to achieve X, Y, and Z goals that are never mentioned unless they're mentioned to attack Joe Biden, right? Such as actually creating some sort of environmentally useful and restorative policy. If that's what you're about, then yeah, start to create a party that's based on that and see whose ears you can get. And in the process, try to make it palatable to other people, join in solidarity with them on their issues, and you start to create a people's movement. The final thing I'll say is I mentioned Bolivia in passing. They just had an election on Sunday. And despite the United States and Canada trying to overthrow their democratically elected socialist politicians and leaders, their movement to socialism party has once again won their elections. And it's because, at least some of the analysis that I've heard is that when the democratically elected leader was overthrown last year, it actually revitalized the people's movement. They took the politics in their hands and they said, despite the violence being perpetrated against us, and believe me, I've heard of some things that I hope to never see in my lifetime that has happened to some of these activists. Despite the United States installing this right-wing dictator who hates us, despite the sanctions, despite all these things, we're going to fight for what we need, and we're going to create this. We're going to put the people in place who we need to do what will help us actually live decent lives. And so that's what I would. That's always what I go to. You got to organize, still vote, but also organize for some other things. Run people when running people makes sense. Raise hell in the streets when raising hell in the streets makes sense. Do what you have to do to make the entire structure begin to bend to your will and hopefully eventually crumble so that we can replace it with something that's even better.
Okay, I think Chris Lee is up next with a question. If you want to jump in, and then I want to go to, if we have time, talk a little bit about Jackson. I know Leslie wanted to talk about that, the Jackson Cush plan, maybe some of this community empowerment sort of approach and community control over politics. But Chris, you're up.
I'm unmuted now, yeah? I also want to thank you for being here, taking part of this. It's real fascinating. I thank you so much. So were you suggesting that maybe if Black Lives Matter or a group with a similar kind of agenda were to form a political party that could force either create enough of a movement on its own to change maybe the political discussion? Because like you were talking about with Biden and the Democratic Party, I mean, maybe it would force them to deal with certain issues more seriously. Because it seems like in the past, I'm not a big American politics guy, but it seems like in the past, other like third parties have formed and then they get absorbed by either the Democrats or Republicans or whatever, right? And so is this, are you saying this is possible, or were you talking about maybe a viable kind of third party that would exist outside of either the Democrats or Republicans?
Yeah, great question. I really appreciate that. Yeah, like I said, I was expecting the chat to blow up, but I can't believe that's never going to work, because it hasn't worked up to this point, at least not at the national level, right? At the same time, though, I do think that locally there are some locales that have run third party or independent, right? Let's not even say third party, just independent candidates for different positions, and they've been able to get into specific positions, even if they run as Democrats. One of the things that I point out is you do have some more progressive folks who claim Democrat, who get into these offices, and so the lead lawyer, what's that called? That position, lead lawyer of the city. All right, that's as good as I can do right now.
Attorney General.
Thank you, Attorney General.
Yeah.
Of Philadelphia. Yeah. He's pretty progressive. He does things like tries police for murder. Who'd have thought you could do that? And again, in my understanding, he's a Democrat, and a lot of things that he pushes, I don't think go far enough, but it's further than what other people have been willing to do at this point. And so I did say third party. I was thinking more strategically, even though I probably didn't say that. But I think it's more the sentiment that you don't have to conform to the very narrow ideas of what is possible that these two parties present, and that even some of the third parties present, right? Once you start to organize people around what they need, and if we could create a people's movement such as the one that I referenced in Bolivia, then really you could take over a party if you have to, or you find a way to empower people, to get them motivated and energized to start to make the changes. That's really the point I was trying to make, more than we need third parties.
Yeah, I got you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so Chesa Boudin in San Francisco is another attorney general who's worth keeping an eye on. He's actually David Gilbert's son.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Was just elected, is really, starting to implement some reforms, but interesting ones. And I think he's exactly in line with what you were talking about. A lot can change from a position like that. So yeah, could be interesting. So Professor Pickering, you had a question about Jackson. You're muted.
There we go. Sorry. Yeah, my question was, where do you think today's manifestation is of this radical, cry for independence and land that the RNA were making? I mean, and how does that fit in with what's going on in Jackson? Maybe you can explain what's going on in Jackson a bit.
Yeah, well, I see it most in organizations like Malcolm X Grassroots Movement. I mentioned it in passing, but it was created by the organization that Chokwe Lumumba helped create in 1984 called the New African Peoples Organization. And if you go to their website, freethelandmxgm.com, and look at what they say they're about, then you'll see the manifestation of this legacy. It's worth noting that the Lumumbas who are still in Jackson, to my, please, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that they continue to be a part of the organization, Malcolm X Grassroots Movement. And they are trying to, from the position of the mayorship, but also through a number of local grassroots organizations, trying to implement things such as solidarity economies, cooperative economic activity that is supposed to help people benefit. It's supposed to help the most people benefit from that economic project as possible, instead of just a few people trying to get rich. So that's where I see it the most. You can Google New African Independence Party, and you can look at their platform. Again, you'll see a lot of the same ideas. There's going to be some variation from what I remember. There are organizations, I mean, I don't even know all the organizations, but there are a number of organizations that either come directly out of the provisional government or New African Peoples Organization, or that are fellow travelers and have been for quite some time, that are really all over the country. And so some of them are super local. Some have more of a presence, such as Rebuild Collective, which puts out an online and physical paper every couple of months. So yeah, I continue to see it. And even M4BL, they have folks from the Malcolm X Grassroots Movement who help out and who help guide what happens. And even though I wouldn't say that they're trying to do the same things that you're asking about, we can see some of that influence.
And what are your thoughts on the MOVE organization in the context of this discussion? That hits a little closer to home for you, right, in outside of Philadelphia.
Yeah. I have a lot of thoughts. They faced similar repression. These are, for folks who are not familiar with MOVE. MOVE organization, it's a group of people who were trying to, create a little bit of independence within the city of Philadelphia, right? That's the oversimplification of it all. And as they were trying to build their families, build their community, they were actually attacked a couple of times by the police. The most infamous police attack was in 1986, when the police firebombed the whole block to get rid of them. It actually killed a number. There were only 2 survivors of that attack. It was a really brutal period in this history. And the people who were able to survive, either because they weren't there, because they had already been imprisoned, they were political prisoners. And I think at this point, most of them have either passed away or have come home.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, it's a lot of the same. People have been doing a lot of the same organizing, trying to, free Mumia Abu Jamal, for example, is one person who's associated with MOVE. And so, yeah, we see the repression, we see the attempts to create some sense of self-determination, and we see youth, even to this day, galvanized by some of these activists and their legacies.
Yeah, great, thank you. I know HBO is doing a series with MOVE organization looking specifically at Mike Africa Jr.'s attempts to bring his family home. And you're right, Delbert was released fairly recently, and Ramona and a number of others. So there was some really great success in terms of liberation there, but after an incredible price was paid. So I think we're unfortunately just about out of time. I really appreciate this talk. You covered a lot of ground and really did a nice job of connecting it to modern issues. And I think there's a lot that we can take away and think about from this. So thank you so much. I hope we get a chance to host you at Niagara University at some point down the road. It'd be nice to meet in person and be able to continue this conversation. But this platform at least gives us the opportunity to start the conversation. And so thank you so much for that. Thank you for your words.
Thanks so much for the invite. I really appreciate all the questions that you all raised.
Great. Well, next week we have a presentation same time on Tuesday on the rights of nature, a workshop looking at community efforts to codify the rights of nature. And we also have on Tuesday evening, Dina Giglio Whitaker, who is a Native American activist who is working to indigenize the environmental movement. I'll send out information on both of those events, but we'll continue on learning and gaining a real appreciation from the insights of people like Dr. Onaci. So thank you again so much. Looking forward to when that next book comes out. It sounds like it's going to be a fascinating one. So thanks for your efforts.
Thanks so much.
Okay. Have a great day. Thank you all.
Take care.